Water here. It really is great to be here. It's been a while since we've been able to kind of present, a panel from an Indigenous perspective, but we thought this would be such a broad, inclusive subject given kind of the history of our media systems in the U.S. But I just wanted to start by first acknowledging the Ute tribal nation, who are the ancestral keepers of the land that we are on. Thank you for allowing us to be here. A group of singers came from the reservation this morning and sang us some beautiful songs at breakfast today, so I feel like it's official that we're here and welcomed as guests. But I wanted to first start off by introducing, our panelists that we have coming today from very different backgrounds and very different forms of work. But I wanted to welcome first Garrett Bradley from New Orleans. Next, we have Sky Hopinka coming to us from the Ho-Chunk and Pechanga nations. Unfortunately, Tommy Orange had to cancel. He caught the flu. Him and his family are bedridden with the flu. But next, we have RaMell Ross. And then we have Amelia Winger-Bearskin from the Seneca Cayuga Nations. And then lastly, Crystal Echohawk from the Pawnee Nation. Well, our conversation today is really, I think, looking at, a lot of, contextual factors in terms of how we, I think we're all kind of, particularly enlightened in thinking about how we look at imagery, how we consume imagery, the context in which we're watching things based upon, the privilege of our media systems and who actually gets to get put out to audiences. But there's a lot of work and very rich work happening in all these different forms, I think, that is really kind of challenging historic misrepresentation and even erasure. And so we just really wanted to kind of explore some of these, some of these factors, but also to acknowledge that there's like such great legacies of work that have been happening for generations and over the course of the 100+ years of American cinema. To kick us off, though, first I wanted to just give Crystal Echohawk an opportunity to kind of present, I guess, as a framework, some really amazing data that she has been working on. A major research project called Reclaiming Native Truth, which she was able to raise and spend quite well, I think, over $4 million, really looking at how Americans perceive Native Americans today. And so I'll just let Crystal kick us off.
Thank you, Bird. Bird is one of our greatest champions, so, So Reclaiming Native Truth, just really quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the creation story of how this came to be. And it was really in 2015, but it's really about a lifetime of just constantly, I've worked in Indian country my entire life for my own tribe, really focused on children and families and tribal sovereignty. I stand on the shoulders of so many different activists and people that come before me, but constantly always feeling like we're invisible, that our issues were not taken seriously, that we weren't gaining the kind of traction that we should be, and having that same conversation with colleagues and watching the way that it was impacting our youth. And I was really inspired by the LGBTQ movement and marriage equality and really kind of seeing how there was a seismic cultural shift happening in the country at that time, and really how public opinion was changing to, it was the ultimate policy change in this land around marriage equality, and how could we learn from that? And so it was really about looking at the court of public opinion and how important that is today, and culture, and really trying to understand that we need to really map what the dominant narratives are around Native people. What do non-Natives think about Native people, and why, and where does that come from, and how can that inform a strategy really to kind of change the narrative and change the story about Native people? So as Bird mentioned, we raised a lot of money for this project. We received an angel investment of $2.5 million from the Kellogg Foundation, and then a whole host of other foundations, tribes, individuals really invested in this project, and we were able to do this level of research, which was really unprecedented and multi-layered and very complex, and allowed us to really bring together the best of the best. And why this was particularly powerful for us as Native people is because we never show up in the data sets, ever. Everything in this country is pretty much defined as pretty much black and white, and sometimes Latino, once in a while maybe Asians, but we're never in the data, so we knew that this was important. And it was really about how do we get a 360 about what people think about us. I mean, everyday average Americans from all walks of life to members of Congress, sitting judges, influencers in media and entertainment, even social justice. We listened to millions of conversations online to really understand how were people talking about Native peoples. And what's really remarkable, the time period we did this was during Standing Rock. So it was really fascinating, a part of our research that really, you're going to find out in just a minute, that Standing Rock was really an awakening for this country. So the biggest finding, when invisibility is not a superpower, and any Native person's going to tell you that this is not necessarily mind-blowing. We've known it all along, but to have this actually within the research and the data, we really found that the significant majority of Americans know little to nothing about Native peoples. They don't know a Native person. Upwards to 40 in one of our polls thought that Native people don't even exist anymore. And if they did exist, they were dwindling population because they don't see them on TV. They don't see them in film. They don't read them about in the papers. They could kind of struggle to recall, like, oh, I learned about them about Thanksgiving, things like that, but really struggled. And so the power of that invisibility was incredible. And to really, understand that what that invisibility translates into is not just a question of diversity inclusion and we need to be included. It really is that it fuels bias. And really we had some of the best people focusing on mind science to really begin to show us how that invisibility really dehumanizes us. And we found with college students in one survey that they were less inclined to support basic civil rights for Native Americans because they didn't know a Native American. It was really hard for them to kind of compute that in their world. And so it's really understanding that the power of invisibility, and I think this isn't just with Native peoples, I think this goes for, it can apply for all kind of people, that this is really how powerful it is. And really how this invisibility, but it's also about erasure as well. But in the invisibility, what it does is it creates a vacuum, right? If you don't see or hear anybody, you don't know anything about them, you are going to be more likely to kind of be informed by stereotypes and caricatures and false narratives that you learn in school. And so that's what we found, is that there was incredibly toxic narratives that people would sort of default to about, we all get free checks for being Indian and we are all rich off of casinos. So really quickly, this is what representation looks like for Native people in media, 0.04%. And that's across the board. And then what we really also learned, there was an important study before we got started that found that 87% of schools in the United States don't teach about Natives past 1900. So you start to understand where that invisibility starts. We're kind of thrown back with ancient civilizations that no longer exist, and that's where it's kind of categorized in the minds of the majority of Americans. And that really what we found again is that erasure and invisibility really are the modern forms of bias today against Native peoples. And, we really struggle with the fact that, in one of these studies, they asked students to ascribe human characteristics, and people struggled to ascribe 60% of human characteristics to Native people. I mean, it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around, but that's what we're dealing with. And it's really these three primary drivers of K through 12 education, as I mentioned before. It's popular culture because we don't show up anywhere in films, and if we do, it's typically 1900 and before, and also the media as well. And this, what it really does is it begins to institutionalize this bias and this racism. So I will leave you with, there's the hopeful part, and where I'm excited for the next storytellers to get up and talk, is that we found that most Americans, when we polled them, were angry that they didn't learn about Native peoples. Standing Rock was an awakening because it was like, oh my gosh, Natives exist and these modern injustices are happening, but they're also really powerful. And so all of this signal that there's a market, there's a demand, there's people that want to know Native stories, they want to know the truth and the true history. And they want to see Indians on TV and on films. And so there's so much hope. And so that's really where we leave it into the next phase of our work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Crystal. And I believe if people really want to dig deep into all of your data, they can go to illuminatives.org to kind of look at the research and read it in detail. It's a thick booklet. They'll even mail it to you. But RaMell, I wanted to ask if maybe you might be able to offer a response from like maybe an African American, point of view to kind of like, the perception of African Americans in our country.
Yeah, I'll pull up this one quote. There's not, like my kind of interest in, African American visuality stems from like a wide kind of conceptual framework. I'd love to see some stats equally to just, types of stereotypical representations on this platform, or the range of works made by X person in this community. I think it would be illuminating for most people because it's something that is so integrated into the natural order of things. It's not even thought about, But this, there's this sort of social philosopher, theorist, Michelle Wallace, who said that, and it's quite simple, but it's quite profound, that pure African-American culture, untainted by the marketplace or by negative images, is inconceivable. Which she's saying, quite simply, that the entire existence of African-American visuality runs parallel with racism, runs parallel with misrepresentation, and there's no separation from it at this point. And so, artists like myself, Garrett Bradley, and those also on this panel working in their, with their own points of view from their own cultures, the goal is to sort of alter this trajectory that is inevitable unless we start taking control of our own images, start digging into archives, repositioning them, refocusing them, and kind of, reaching for, this is what I call visual justice, which is accounting, like we know social justice, like accounting for the redlining, but we don't know visual justice. We haven't thought about the way in which we can save a young black kid from being harassed when he has a hood on and he's running down the street. That's a circumstance of media. That's not a circumstance of natural life. That's because the majority of images of black men have been on the news and have been here, and we know these things, but I don't think that we've quite intentionally sort of used media as a site for change because it's so wrapped up in commerce.
Yeah. And I also think that, I think going back to kind of an article that I read by a particular scholar of, the first Birth of a Nation and the characterization of black men in that film and one of the first feature films ever made, I think has really kind of carried through and contributed to that, right? Yeah. Garrett, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you do the work that you do?
Well, I started off actually in photography as well, but doing concert photography, and that was a completely different world. But I think I've been making little films and stuff since I was in high school, and I think all of it, I was asked to, you had to think about my process for writing something, and I really went through each one of everything I've made, which I haven't done in a really long time, and I think that barrier is sort of been a consistent thread in all of my work, thinking about a barrier that exists between people, within a community, and how that relates oftentimes to race and to gender, specifically in America. And for the past 9 years, I've lived in New Orleans, and so that sort of general theme has found itself in a Southern American space. And I'm interested in sort of like where, specifically where does the South find itself in relationship to now? And what is the beginning of our country, and how does that sort of articulate itself today through images and icons and through barriers?
That's great. Amelia, I'm jumping around for our tech people. They're going to be so furious at me. I was supposed to start with Amelia first. But Amelia, why don't you give us a little bit of context to your work? Because you're working kind of in the immersive media, technological space, I think doing really fascinating work, and you wrote this really great article about decentralizing narrative. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. I'll see if my clicker clicks. Oh, there we go. Back one. Hi, my name is Amelia Winger-Bearskin. I work in virtual reality, augmented reality. My background in academia is primarily in artificial intelligence, machine learning, and decentralized knowledge systems similar to blockchain. And my desire to go into that was heavily informed by my native culture, actually. I'm Seneca Cayuga Nation of Oklahoma. See a lot of Oklahomans out here. And we're Iroquois, and when Tabitha first asked, talked to me about this panel and thinking about erasure in the media that we, find ourselves in, I thought a lot about the media that I grew up with. And I thought it's like if my storytelling culture was like a beautiful sparkling water, and someone came to me and said, I'd like you to put this sparkling water into my media, and I have this beautiful basket that is, made of netting. And I would say, well, it won't fit in there, right? It'll fall out, it'll slip out. That's not, it's the medium, the container, the form doesn't even quite hold it. And that's how I feel about the native practice within the medium of cinema. I've found a place that I feel holds parts of it within artificial intelligence and decentralized storytelling. Because that's the way in which we told stories. They were reflective of the live audience that was there with us. They were interactive in the sense that never would I, if I was, my mother is a traditional storyteller, but even the way that she tells stories, never would she tell this story the same way with a different audience. They would be interactive and they would be part of that story. The ending that she would tell would necessitate being different because of the person who gave it to her, would require that she becomes a branch of that narrative, much the way a fractal would then move forward in itself and replicate itself backwards. This is a corn husk doll, which is a famous story within our culture, and this is an image of it from the Met. And these corn husk dolls, you have a story about why they have no face. But it's interesting that the corn husk doll and the story of why she has no face is actually a story about technology. It was a way of teaching our advanced system of agriculture to young children. If you can't tell a story forwards and backwards in time, then it has no ability to have an impact for generations to come. So again, it's not about it just being a linear story from beginning to end. If it isn't embedded within other media that a child could make, something that you could perfect as an older woman, something that you could make one so good that it ends up in the Met. If you can't do that, then your ability to teach the technology that you need to live, or the story that has the morals and values of your culture, then it isn't storytelling. So I think about this is what people often say is the first draft of the Constitution. This is our wampum contract considered the great law of peace. And the contracts that we made through storytelling and an oratory process. We also considered them to be the value of trade in a public distributed ledger, which are words that those of you who are familiar with blockchain would recognize as being the way in which blockchain is also formed. So in technology, I'm seeing mirrors to my culture, and I'm seeing an ability to embed the cultural values that I have in new ways, in addition to the ways in which we're doing within traditional film and documentary. So.
That's so great. I love the title of your article. It was like, before we were talking about decentralization was talking about us?
I was talking to everyone. Yeah.
Oh, talking to everyone. Yeah. So if you guys...
We used to just gossip and talk to each other, and now blockchain says we gossip and talk to each other. So I don't know. It's fun.
And you guys have to Google this article and read it, because I reread it, and it's so fascinating. She took this ancestral narrative, and then Amelia recounts it in her article, but she has, corn husk woman sitting by, which is the story, sitting by a lake, admiring her reflection and taking selfies of herself.
Yeah, you have to talk to your audience, It's on the internet, I don't know.
I love that. RaMell, what about you? How do you approach your work? Like, what is the driving force of it?
Yeah, so I think, generally speaking, it's kind of like, I feel like this is true for most people, but it's difficult. I kind of articulate it differently every time, so I say that it's sort of evolving. But I think about it now, specifically as it relates to the last two projects I've done, just in a relationship to this sort of like disintegration and reintegration with the person who's viewing it. So the goal of the piece is to sort of be something that's so maybe perhaps teeming or so open that a person steps into it and then it sort of becomes part of, it's inextricable from their life experience in some sense. And I enter into that through photography, like Garrett. I'm in Alabama, I'm making photos, and I take a photo of one of my students, and I can't imagine that someone comes to this image with any sort of new, it's just a portrait, like any sort of new understanding of them. And it becomes quite clear that imagery, cinema, all of these things, they literally replace experience. So that's their goal. Their goal is to bring you something from somewhere else. And it's incumbent on the person who's making it, I think, to be entirely conscious of the cultures in which the images are being dropped into and the way in which they're predisposed to encounter the folks that they're dealing with, and so, or they're encountering. And so I became incredibly interested in making images that had a sort of strategic ambiguity that forced a person to, participate in the meaning of the piece, sort of, put in their imagination. And that turns, or that tips to film, in that this guy Darby English, who's a critic at MoMA, channels philosopher William James and says the goal, and he's speaking specifically for Black artists, and maybe this isn't the ultimate goal, but perhaps this is one strategy for compensating for the history of negative imagery, is to replace conception with perception. And so we live in a world of social constructs, obviously. The problem is, to channel another philosopher, I hate being the quote person, but they say such good stuff. He's like, a wall's, who said this? Well, anyway, I remember. He says, a wall's a social construct, but I can't walk through it, we have to contend with the history of imagery. We can't blindly make without understanding the way in which it structures our movement through the world and what we understand. And so replacing conception with perception is offering someone an experience of something, not an explanation, an illustration, a depiction, a rendering, but to work with cinema and its sensorial possibilities and its way the way the camera can embody, the way that movement can expand a person's understanding of their outside surroundings in the context of social lives, in order to replace the experience properly, to replace the experience as much as possible with, the sort of holistic, universal things that are the human experience, which way dominate the way in which we've organized reality. Yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, because I think a lot of times when I'm speaking to Native communities about, trying to encourage more Indigenous Native storytellers, I always say that, specifically, in American cinema, that, and I think I'll broaden my concept, but thanks to this panel, is that no other filmmakers carry, I think, such a larger burden than Native filmmakers, who have to deconstruct 100+ years of cinema made about us without our involvement, and then while also trying to create something new and authentic and fresh, because we always have to over-explain, according to the research, yes, we are still here, blah, 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 blah.
It's
Still
interesting.
human.
My producer, Jocelyn Barnes, we were talking the other day about, historical imaging and photos from the past, and she was like, when folks were photographing the Native American community, they took pictures as if they were already extinct. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the middle of their culture. This is when the fullest time when folks are coming over, when photography is first born. All of the photos are if they're already historical people. Yeah. And that contributed, obviously, to the state of things.
Yeah. There's the famous photographer, Edward Curtis. He took all these, historic photos. You've all seen them, the iconic Native photos. But he was motivated because he felt like we were a disappearing race. He wanted to capture us. And so a lot of our people in our community, I think, really base a lot of kind of contemporary kind of clothing ideas based on those photos. But a lot of times they were so overly constructed. He would go in there and say, okay, and he would over-decorate them. And he'd say, okay, dress like you think that people before you dressed like. So there was a lot of inauthenticity about it. So I think that also lends to the continued deconstruction, I feel like, that Native filmmakers are really constantly trying to engage in. Sky, what about you? What's your motivation and drive for making the kinds of films you make?
A lot of the different things that have been talking about so far have been really informative for how I view, or how I hold a camera, how I edit, and how I choose the stories that I want to tell. Even just thinking about what these stories are, or how they fit into this larger, community pool of different people trying to do different things, where often I don't want to feel like I have to be the voice or make the film about a certain experience that is indigenous, but rather look at the different stories that exist outside of that specific desire from often a white audience to tell stories about suffering, poverty, boarding schools, historical racism, everything that's, I don't know, these are things that I've grown up with, and they're very important to tell, but they don't have to be the only thing that we can tell. And so what does it mean to investigate a relationship between a father and son? What does it mean to make up a myth for a plant that my tribe used to revive people that fainted? These are all things that are very quiet in how they exist into the larger scheme of who we are, but they add to this different constellation of ideas around our identity, even though the idea of ours is we're not as collective as that, you know, but sometimes we are. Like there's 563 federally recognized tribes in the US.
Yeah.
573.
570, wow. Okay, yeah. And that's just in the United States, and that doesn't include tribes without federal recognition. So there's a huge spectrum of different ideas of what it means to be indigenous or a member of a tribe or a community. And so what does it mean to make work for a specific community? If I make work for my tribe, my clan, my family, what are the things that I can do that I don't have to contextualize what I'm trying to talk about? I don't have to explain what different things mean from like my family, my beliefs, my perspective. And then once you don't have to explain to a primarily white audience what everything means, that frees you up to I don't know, go into things that haven't really been talked about too much, and find these different areas of who we are that have been dormant, sleeping, and see how they have a chance to grow using these different medias like cinema or the internet or, I don't know, I guess those are the only two things that I know. Literature, poetry, you know? So it's just a matter of trying to do a small thing, a small little gesture, whether it's a 15-minute film, a 20-minute film, or however, and tell the story that honestly no one is asking me to tell. And just go and do it.
And I think we have a clip of one of your pieces,
yes,
right?
We do. Oh man, I don't know how to use this.
I don't know if Standing Rock would have happened as fast as it did, you know, back in the day of even just like dial-up, you know. The way we've been kind of conditioned with social media, I feel like that had a hand in the way we communicated those rumors and those the hearsay. Like everything was so fast all the time. Like even without like cell phone signals, we still managed to make it go so fast all the time. I feel kind of the same as I did back when I was in camp. That whole like trust no one, like no one person is the authority on this, because some events have been written down and shared and sort of like made their way into like collective consciousness, and they're just not like accurate.
Feels good. Feels like this is where it's supposed to happen at, you know. And show the world. How many times done? Everybody needs to know about this, you know. There should be more here. All the way over to the river over there. It should be that long of a cat.
I feel like there's a bit of nostalgia to it. Maybe I'm wrong, but even just this like we evacuated in January, but I keep forgetting bad stuff that happened. To my ability to speak, like, and I forget that because my time there, and I don't know if, and I don't know if this is the same, I can only speak for myself, but my time there is now being sort of cast into this magical rose-colored nostalgia. But it was like this. I don't know. Do you think that was like accurate, the critiques, the criticisms, and the reasons why we're reluctant to criticize?
So,
Can you explain that piece?
yeah, that's a piece called Dislocation Blues from 2017. And really, it's about trying to process without explain. It's a very disjointed, short documentary, experimental documentary, where I want to keep the stories that were being told to me private in a certain way, but I want to talk about the processing and like how do we process this event that happened? How do we process all of a sudden everyone is looking at this small community in North Dakota that's native, and how do you deal with being looked at, and how do you be critical of yourself and in that movement when there is no, even things were so complicated there in the sense that, there were many camps and many different ideas of success and failure. And what does it mean to try and find one's own place within this area? But then also, how do you be critical of it? How do you challenge what happened? And how do you then move forward and, I don't know, take those lessons learned and use them into the next thing, or the next movement, or the next everyday gesture of being?
Thank you, Sky.
you.
Garrett, we seem to have skipped over your clip. We have a clip of yours from America. Do you want to set it up, or shall we just play it?
We can watch it.
Okay. Let's go ahead and play Garrett's clip. So you really explore these ideas and notions of erasure in a lot of your work. Can you explain some of that to us?
Yeah, I mean, with this particular project, actually, I was looking at, the source material was this Burt Williams film called Limekiln Club Field Day. It's kind of a tongue twister that the MoMA found in 2013, so 100 years after it had been made in 1913. And I had initially just read a newspaper article about it, and was really struck by even just at that time, the few clips that I had seen online that were just exploring elements of joy and leisure amongst the Black community that I had never seen during that time period. And the more I was learning about how the film was made, the more sort of inspired I was, because Burt Williams was, he was donning blackface in the film, but the way that he was sort of posturing himself and the way that he sort of used himself as sort of a strategy within the greater context of the film was really powerful. So he's a super tall guy, and you see him sort of like making himself smaller and hiding amongst everybody having a great time and looking beautiful. And the film was never finished, so it's a series of outtakes that they assembled at the museum, and they were kind enough to allow me to sort of work with the material in this new project. And in going through it, I would go through frame by frame, because it's 17 frames a second, and sometimes you can't always capture these incredible moments that were in between of him giving direction or actually asserting himself, and you see the power that existed between him and his white producers. It was an integrated production, and it's what they thought to be the very first integrated.
1913.
Yes.
Wow.
Very, very first integrated film production ever is what they think. So what America is trying to do is looking back at that work and saying, okay, maybe there's this huge body of work that's equally as progressive that we don't know about. And what does it mean to think about erasure from a place of creating new images that are iconic, that are both replacing taking an image, like the Boy Scouts, for instance, or church, like we see here, and providing a new meaning for it. And I called the film America, even though I was sort of like embarrassed by how big that title was, but I did it for a reason, because I was thinking about Instagram, and I was thinking about the internet, and I was thinking about how when you put something out into the world, all of these images are attached to words that end up on the internet. And so if I can start to use the material that I've been working with as a way to replace other images that exist for what America looks like, it could be a really powerful tool.
Didn't you say there was also a very specific act of kind of like destroying historical African American films and work?
Well, it wasn't, I couldn't speak, because I'm not a scholar, I couldn't speak too specifically about what those acts were. For me, it's more about understanding in history that there was this huge period of time where there were Black projectionists and performers and directors and producers, and a lot of that was happening right after Plessy versus Ferguson, which happened in 1896, which was also the same year that the modern day projector was invented. So this is, for the first time, people can be in a room together and watch something, and it's also when people are starting to separate. So the mixture of those two things, for whatever reason, combusted into this like huge movement of cinema, which I would argue has been sort of a consistent thread from the beginning of time. And the way that I talk about the film is that there's a bit of a frustration, for me at least, about this idea that Black cinema or any sort of peripheral cinema is a wave or a movement, and to me it really implies perpetual crashing.
Right.
And in fact we're continuously going, we're running parallel to our understanding of everything else. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I want to go back to my mention of Edward Curtis, because I went at the Getty Museum one time, they found a film by Edward Curtis at the turn of the century that he had made, and they restored it, and it was a silent film, and so they presented it with a score, and I went to some of the academic panels they had earlier that day, and they talked about his motivation for making that film, and apparently, at the turn of the century, the marketplace was flooded with native content films. It was a hot topic. Audiences would pay to go to see it. They were incredibly wrong. And his motivation for wanting to make that film was because he wanted to present something more authentic in terms of native imagery, and that was his effort. It's called In the Land of the Headhunters, if you come across it. And he shot it. He created a narrative. He went to one of the Northwest Coast tribes up in kind of British Columbia area, cast from within the community, and had them act out, this narrative. And so they brought in actually some descendants of those people who were, in that piece of work to the screening that I went. It was really quite profound and kind of jarring to think that that one, our marketplace was flooded with native imagery. I'm waiting for that to happen again. But I was also thinking, I was like, oh my God, I'm trying to do the same thing 100 years later. Am I achieving that? Anyway, but I don't know. But like, what do you? I just want to ask each and every one of you, like, what are your thoughts on misrepresentation, erasure? I think through through the work of film.
Oh, please.
I mean, one thing I actually just getting to that, but also something that both Sky and RaMell mentioned, I think touching on just the idea of abstraction and the role of that when it comes to being, again, a marginalized filmmaker artist. Darby English, for instance, wrote this book called 1971 that looked at a show that happened, that was commissioned by the Manil in Houston, Texas, and the goal of it was to take hard art, so abstract art, into the community and actually share it with, so it wasn't just this sort of elite space. And, something that I've learned, in speaking with artists from that time period, my father being one of them, was this idea of abstraction being sort of a political way for you to sort of dare other people to say that your identity or who you are is in some kind of way a part of your work. And that it was this sort of freeing way of being able to work, and I think you guys both have sort of touched on that a bit. And so when I think about erasure, I mean, on one hand, it's interesting because, us all coming from these different places, like I think about, Blackness in America, it's like we have kind of almost the opposite problem in the sense that we are everywhere. We determine clothing. We've created this culture in a lot of ways. Clothing, music. I mean, all of it is coming from Black culture. But the way in which it's being controlled and the way in which it's being seen, it's almost like needing to shift the dimension of that a little bit, as opposed to taking something that is completely almost invisible, that we're not seeing at all, and creating new images from that. So there's actually a really interesting, I think, negative and positive space there. Like,
I often think about a lot of the work that I think Crystal frames in this idea of narrative change. I'm like, are we actually trying to change the narrative if there isn't really one? I think we're trying to establish the narrative. I don't know. I kind of wrestle with a lot of these concepts. But Amelia, what do you think?
Well, I talked to my son right before this panel. He's 17. And I'm like, what are you up to? And he's like, oh, I'm making some video games with my other friends. His other friends are this group of native kids that all make video games together. And I thought about him and how he doesn't watch any movies. He doesn't watch any TV shows that come from a studio. He watches, maybe Vine compilations, R.E.P. Vine, and he watches YouTubers that play other indie games that his friends made, and then watches those, and then watches people on Twitch play video games, and then act out stories on Fortnite, and use essentially all of these off-the-shelf things to create puppetry of their own stories that reflect their own community and their own stories. And I was like, damn, yeah, that's like kind of just pretty native, though, And I really liked that. And I think if I'm maybe more interested in saying, like, let's go back that 100 years and restart with cinema when we used to be like so famous in cinema, and then we were absent, and like go back and fill it, and maybe just reach out to that younger generation that's already telling their stories on their own terms with their own medium, and do not care that we didn't give them permission.
Yeah.
So, which I think is really fascinating. So, I don't know. They're already doing it. They're out there sharing their stories to each other. And there's over 1 million people watching Twitch at any given time and watching someone else tell their story with these puppets that are video games. I don't know. It's very fascinating to me. So.
Yeah. RaMell?
Yeah, I think it's like so much about, in the same way that we have, so anyway, the philosopher I forgot was Charles Mills. But so much of it is about the same way that we were like deconstructing how civilization came to be. We need to deconstruct how visuality is integrated into perception, how the visual field is codified as racist. It's not just it's racist, it's that like it's actually the way in which we see. And I feel like the kids and the youth, we need to have these conversations, because even now the default is still racist, right? And so if you give like folks cameras, they're still going to use it in a Eurocentric way. Yeah. They're still going to use the camera as a fundamental othering mechanism. I talk a lot about when I teach photography. Like, when I was taught photography, you use a camera to point at something to say it's important. But that's counter to a lot of religions, you know? The camera in cinema is born into a certain idea of what the world is. And also, strangely enough, photography and cinema is coinciding with a new sort of interpretation of the world, right? I'm reading this book by Akil Mbebe, and he talks about like the plantation and how complex it was when slaves were first brought over because there was no order, right? So then you had black people who were controlling black people. You had runaway slaves who were captured but then could earn their way out of slavery, that they were black. You had white people working for black people. It was just crazy. They're like the power was just too crazy. And so what they did was they started to just, make distinguishing characteristics by color and by race. And then that made the slave master's job easier because there was less revolt, Now, then this shifts to photography, and then we reinscribe what that system is into a visual form. Then that gets perpetuated into the world. And then we have, I say this quote all the time, that Bell Hooks says the only site for resistance for black folks was the family archive. Because that's where we were photographing each other, and it wasn't going out into a world and it was responsible for anything else aside from our own visualization. So to think about the way in which this sort of slave plantation idea of difference shifts to photography, shifts to the world, that being the default, in the same way that if you go to any city, the default is redlining. Therefore, when you walk down the street, you're participating in a movement through the world that is racism. That's how visual culture is. It's all kind of inextricable from the times. But imagine Facebook before. Remember Facebook before it was likes, when it was like everyone's own friend and family archive. Yeah. And it was like, oh my God. I was like, it's incredible. Everyone can represent themselves. Black folks are finally going to be able to do it. But then the same capitalist system in which you buy images gets transferred to likes. And then you're now reaching towards this platonic ideal of beauty that is once again beholden to this past of misrepresentation, and then it just perpetuates in this wild way. So I feel like education, as to this being a problem, with giving our youth, Chiwe's here, who's an amazing guy, works at Ford, critic, intellectual, whatever. Him and Kara took a whole bunch of artists and sent them up to Canada to get at the bottom of VR development. How do you take those who know about the history of visuality and bring them into these new systems so they don't codify the reality that we have now into the future of, and it just becomes an even more complex problem, I know that was long, but I wanted to say so much.
No, I think that's relatable to Sky. I feel like that's kind of your approach as well. I mean, it's trying to break the code, and I feel like some of the bases of your work that I kind of observe is in this documentary form. One of our hosts, and we did a program in the Miccosukee tribal nation outside of Miami recently, and we asked one of our local hosts to kind of offer some comments at the beginning, and he said, "A world without documentary is like a home without, family albums." I thought that was so profound. But your work, I feel like, really challenges kind of ethnographic approaches to historical films that have always been made about us, but they kind of start in that vein, and then it kind of breaks the form. Is that intentional?
Yes. Totally intentional. Well, it's this idea of how we have been represented or studied through the ethnographic lens or the anthropological lens, and then how that informs how we view ourselves through the same sort of scientific sort of idea of who we are. And I mean, even just this idea that all representation is misrepresentation in some form. And I don't know if that's really profound or, I don't know, really dumb, but I did not get high before this at all, so it's all representation is misrepresentation, But it's just this idea that, there is no uniform mode of representing who each one of us are as individuals, and that's gotten a lot more complicated as we've gotten to today. And even thinking about how we are forced to define ourselves, it's often by attrition. We're often asked to define ourselves by who we are not. I'm not this, I'm not that, my people are not this, my people are not that, my community isn't this and not that. And there's so much weight and burden that goes into that act of saying everything that you're not, whether it's a racist stereotype, I'm not Chief Wahoo, I'm not a Redskin, I'm not anything else that I don't want to go into, you know? So there's all these different realms of attrition that go into definitions of who we are. And so what does it mean to not have to define oneself by what you're not, but rather than what you have the potential to be, or where your community can go, or where your storytelling often may lead you to. And for me, that's often what this ethnographic or ethnopoetic sort of thing is tied to. It's like, what are the things that can't be explained through words? What are the things that can't be explained through making a 90-minute documentary with talking heads? And then what does it offer to then go beyond those forms and think about what storytelling would look like in 2018 using these tools, and not so much being tied to the conventions that have defined how we look at ourselves for the last 100 years. And like that film, In the Land of the War Canoes, or In the Land of the Headhunters, is a really interesting example of, is this accurate representation, or is this part of Edward Curtis's fantasy that then we're looking back on? And also the agency that people have in revitalizing those different films, like when the family added their voices to it and the soundtrack to it. That's an act of ownership and reclamation that I think is really important, that allows for some agency in how we can control our archive, as well as how we can control how we're moving forward.
Can I say one thing after that? I think kind of what you're saying, like the representation is misrepresentation, is just as much that we need to start talking about photography and cinema as much as a problem as it is as a wonderful thing. I don't think that it's talked about in terms of what it's done negatively, just more as something that's wonderful. And so once that happens, then there's leadway with redefinition, because that's not because it's it's so indexical and visceral. Photographs and films have a religious quality, you know? There's you almost put all of your faith of truth, even in fiction. You know, people watch fiction films and they're like, damn, that Abraham Lincoln, you know? And you're like, what the fuck? That's great. That's Daniel Day-Lewis. They're like, wait, that wasn't, well, it was still good. And you're just like, what?
Yeah, the screen has power. As we've all seen, you look at this 20-foot screen and it has power, and we trust what's on there. We're trained to trust what's on there. Yeah. And so then how do we stop, questioning the power that we have as moving image makers, and thinking about what does it mean to not trust our own selves, or just questioning the power that we have.
I work a lot in the crypto space, like crypto security and the right to be invisible, right? The right to be hidden, the right to not have your data be owned by other people, the right to not have your data be centralized, the power that's, I think sometimes in this fantasy that I have, that maybe there'll be a moment in the world where people will want to be invisible again and own their own image again, and their own body, and their own the history, their family history, their own archive, and I feel like they'll come to us, and we'll be like, we know how to be invisible. If you would zoom into any, you can, I was trying to show someone my reservation on Google Maps, and it was just this, giant, empty spot, or where nothing was in Google Maps. I'm like, yeah, that's it, that's what's up. And everyone knows what I'm talking about, and yeah, so we know how to be hidden, and there is going to be a point where I think that becomes exceptionally valuable to all of us, to know that there are spaces without data that you can be, and those spaces right now in this country are native.
My colleague Kamala Harris talks about why Snapchat and Instagram stories are so popular, especially with the younger generations. It's this notion that they've grown up with photo albums, permanent images of their childhood. And so they crave this idea of a temporary image that will go away and that will never exist again. Which I think is kind of feeding into what you're saying, the idea of invisibility, maybe not related to invisibility, but an image that will go away, that won't be seen again. They crave that because there's such permanency, in the idea of a photo, especially when you're naked in the sink. Being bathed by your grandma. Not that there's one of those of me.
Yeah, also to be to strive to be photographic is a way of self-empowerment and betterment. It's a way of being your best self in some sense, even if it's temporary. Mm-hmm. It counters depression. Yeah, to see yourself as you could best be seen, by your own standards, whatever, even if they're not your voice.
Yeah.
Which is sad.
Yeah.
I I would say that it's interesting just thinking about that also, because I wonder if the instantaneousness of it is also then you have the rush of the reaction, right? And to maintain that, if something lasts forever, to maintain the value of something for that long is much harder than if you know it's going to be up for 30 seconds, you know what I mean? Or for a day.
Yeah.
And so it also, there's something interesting there. I feel like we could have a whole other panel about like memory and value and like how, you know, how those images play a really different kind of role than the archive, you know, on some level.
I have to apologize. I said my colleague Kamal Harris. It's Kamal Sinclair.
Yeah.
I have Kamala Harris on the brain running for president. Sorry.
Wow, where'd you hang out with her?
Apologies. Misrepresentation.
Shout outs to Miss Sinclair.
I'm guilty of the act as well. But what about, does anyone have any like reflection on kind of, was there a first time when you experienced an authentic representation? You know, in moving image, filmmaking, anything?
Well, I have a funny one yesterday, or right before I came here, my hairdresser cut my hair in her living room in Brooklyn, and she was watching Star Trek Voyager, and she was like, oh my God, is this like offensive to you that there's like Chakotay, who's this native in space? And I'm like, girl, natives in space. Like, I'm a futurist right here. I'm in VR. Are you kidding me? Like, what? Sci-fi, Indians in space. Thank you. So, yeah. I'm a nerd. I'm sorry, I'm a nerd. Yeah, okay, I'm a nerd. I don't know, what's up?
I was always inspired by pigs in space, which is kind of related.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
see, you know, in
Yeah,
space.
the Muppets.
We're in space.
Yeah.
Well, actually, when that question, I was immediately thinking about, I had Drugstore, Cowboys, and Killer of Sheep. For some reason, my mom had them on VHS. And those are the two movies that I watched probably from when I was in middle school to high school over and over again. And I remember Drugstore Cowboys in particular feeling two completely different worlds, but addiction and and drug use and I think maybe being around that as a young person and seeing that on film, and then also comparing that to Killer of Sheep, which had this completely different way of connecting with reality that was. Jeffrey Scholar actually writes about this a lot, which was that it was in no way explicitly talking about the history of America or slavery, but it was sort of there in every frame. And so I remember from a young age feeling like I could connect on a very literal level with things that were on camera, and also in this other way that was much more kind of emotionally connected. And there's something about those two worlds also just being so separate and yet really connected in a kind of interesting way.
I would wanted one thing I remember very much is smoke signals, and I mean I can't remember how old I was. I'm sure I was like baby, right? But yeah, that was the first time like being really conscious, like oh my gosh. And you know, I think the other one that really stands out to me is seeing some of Sterling Harjo's first work. I mean, it was just kind of like wow. I mean, that's really real. But I mean, to kind of take it even one step further to kind of complete the circle, I think last year. There was a big national Indian conference, and it was the 30th anniversary of smoke signals, and it was at the Pechanga Reservation in Southern California. They have this massive auditorium, and they were going to screen it, and they had the cast kind of, you know, beam in, and it was packed. And so much of the audience was young Native people. And they knew the lines, and it was just what really struck me is like this is 30 years old, and there's this hunger. There is this hunger for Native people to see themselves authentically, and they're ready. I mean, there's just such an opportunity, and I think it was really powerful to see what that to really young kids in the audience.
Man, I'm so jealous of you had Killer of Sheep as a child. What? I had like Major Pain and like Fern Gully. Those are like I'm like watching those like
Fern Gully was great, man. That was good.
Yeah, Major Pain was video. But no, I mean like when I think of like authentic representation, which is why I loved your short film so much. Like when I saw yours and I see a Pichapong receptacle's work, there's something that is singular about it. There's something that's mysterious about it. There's something that I will never know and that I could never do about it. You know, that to me like speaks to like to what every single person should be doing, you know? And like the synthesis of all of those is, I feel like, what mainstream culture should be, just like these instantiations of like points of view from person's perspective where they've sort of shed the indoctrination of traditional image making, and they're just making something that is risky and confusing and challenging, but also soothing. I mean, it's quite, yeah, that, to me, like, that's what authentic representation is. And I don't know if I've quite, and you know what the problem is that authentic representation also works from baseline platitudinal representations of culture. Like the films that are out there now are pretty authentic, as they are clones of clones, you know? But I think that we need so much more to sort of evolve beyond the cultural politics of the times, you know?
I have to say, I remember going to watch this one film growing up with my mother, and it was this film, I don't even know when, I must have been 7, 8 years old, Windwalker? Windwalker. And it was amazing because it was a Cheyenne language period piece feature film, but my mother's Cheyenne. And so for her to go see that film, I think, and to also to see that through her eyes, for her to hear our language, you know, within a feature film in a movie theater, I thought was quite profound. And I said, Mom, is like, because I didn't quite understand fully the language. I was like, how is their Cheyenne? She's like, oh, it's okay. You know. But I thought that was kind of amazing. Sky?
Definitely Chakotay and Voyager. Yeah, he was pretty big for me. He was really ridiculous, but
Well, it's like it needs to be camp and glamour and drama, and that's for me. And space.
Exactly. Yeah. Even like someone like, I don't know, like John Redcorn on King of the Hill. I mean, just like hearing some of the jokes that he would make, I thought that was like, as a young teenager, I thought that was kind of cool. But I think when I was older, seeing The Exiles as well as Fast Runner, those were pretty big films for me, and seeing what the potential of cinema could be, or how these stories could exist beyond the ones that I feel that I don't know. I mean, I love Smoke Signals, but I've seen it way too many times. If you take any Native American Studies class, you will watch it. I swear to God.
We need more.
But yeah, so I mean, those films like were pretty informative for very different reasons in different stages of my life. Whether it's as a child and seeing a Native man on screen, or a teenager and seeing like a cartoon character, or these films that are expanding what the potential of cinema could be, like over the course of my life. And I'm 34 years old now, so it's really exciting too, seeing like how there's a lot of different Native artists, indigenous. Even expanded, like, the definition of indigeneity is who are all trying to, or at least arriving at the same sort of presence or perspective around how to complicate the idea of representation and identity and indigeneity and what it means to move forward from that.
One thing I wanted to just, coming back to this issue around erasure and invisibility, again, what the evidence tells us, what the mind science tells us is how powerful it is and how devastating it is. It's, again, it's not being politically correct. I mean, it really fuels bias and discrimination and racism in this country, and what we learned is that can start to be broken apart by contemporary representations. I mean, and I can only speak with what we learned around Native people, but that's what starts to break through it. And that's why Standing Rock was so powerful. It just erupted, and that's what I was thinking about, Sky, with your clip, is that, we had polled Americans, they said, no, we don't know anything. And then we started doing focus groups, and people came in and they said, well, I don't really know anything about Native Americans, but yeah, that pipeline thing with those Indians. Wow. And what was incredible is the majority of people that we surveyed were supportive of Standing Rock. But it was the first time that Native people had penetrated their consciousness in school. So I bring that back around to how important the work is every one of you is doing, because of around this issue of invisibility and erasure, and how important I look at many of you in this audience who probably have the power to create platforms to get these stories out. It's so important. I mean, it really does have an impact. And so I just, I'm like the nerd on the end down here that doesn't have anything super cool to say, except for, I'm like the data lady. Okay, good, we're together. But just how powerful it is. And like Bird and I were having this conversation. By the way, he wrote the most beautiful piece in the Hollywood Reporter this last week that you all have to check out. But there's so much talent, there's so many powerful stories, there's so much beautiful art being made, but it's not seen. So we just really have to work even harder to create platforms and visibility for these stories.
I would say also, just to riff off that I think it's also like an emphasis on the way in which we can tell those stories is really important, because I think that that's kind of what we've all been saying in our own way too. But I certainly, like in the research I did and going through the archives of Black cinema that exists in the Library of Congress, it was actually incredible to see how experimental it was. You know, then this was like before we had standards and certain aesthetics that we were supposed to fit into. It was incredibly playful and radical, and I think we're kind of, that's always been happening, but we can keep it moving, keep it going.
I wanted to, I know Tommy couldn't make it here, but I wanted to kind of read a bit of an excerpt from his book. I don't know, have any of you guys read There? Yeah. It's on the New York Times bestseller list. It'll soon be, it's being developed for series by Sterling Harjo, who's one of our native directors. Sterling, are you here? Yeah. Do a war cry if you are. It's, I'll just read it because I thought it was it's in the prologue of the book, but he says, "We've been defined by everyone else and continue to be slandered despite easy to look up on the internet facts about the realities of our histories and current state as a people. We have the sad, defeated Indian silhouette and the rolling heads down temple stairs. We have it in our heads, Kevin Costner saving us, John Wayne six-shooter slaying us, an Italian guy named Iron Eyes Cody playing our parts in movies. We have the litter-morning, tear-ridden Indian in the commercial, also Iron Eyes Cody, and the sink-tossing Jack Nicholson-saving crazy Indian who was the narrator in the novel the voice of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We have all the logos and mascots, the copy of the image of an Indian in a textbook, all the way from the top of Canada, the top of Alaska, down to the bottom of South America. Indians were removed, then reduced to a feathered image. Our heads are on flags, jerseys, and coins. Our heads were on the penny first, of course, the Indian head cent, and then on to the buffalo nickel, both before we could even vote as a people, which, like the truth of what happened in history all over the world, and like that spilled blood from slaughter, is now out of circulation." You know? And I think that I wanted to read that because I feel like it ties, I think, the root of a lot of what we're talking about in terms of our conversation, going back to the history of our country and also the process of colonization. You know, I think it's a very specific intent, I think, for the roles that both of our communities played in the establishment of this country, to build it on the backs of slavery and on the blood of people who owned the land. And I think that the colonization process is really at the root, I think, of a lot of this erasure and purposeful misrepresentation, that our continued systemic exclusion still continues to occur to this day by our current media systems. But do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
It's
Not to bring it down a little, but anyway.
I would say, yeah, that's definitely true. But I think it's even more nuanced than that too. Just again, going back to, and I think that this goes, across platforms from the film industry to the art world of like, which images are we allowed to show? Like, which are the images that we're encouraged to make in order to sell? Yeah. And so I think that the impetus is just as much on us as artists to think about what is the role of trauma for commerce in our own work, and how do we actively work against that?
Yeah. And I think that you were saying one of the, I think, inspirations for your work is trying to make films outside of that vein of trauma, right? But I also kind of feel like, given a lot of this, I think one of you touched on this earlier, this like kind of idea of trying to address historic themes and all, and where filmmaking becomes reactive filmmaking, and then it kind of lends itself to become a bit more kind of essentialism, in cinema. I think there's kind of like this fine line that we constantly, have to navigate. Just a thought.
Actually, I mean, it's like, I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to like erase that idea of trauma, or that's everything is like, ignored that it ever happened. It's you mentioned this earlier, that it's there, it's there, and if you do something that doesn't point at it, it can still be felt. It's like that trauma is always going to be present, and it's always going to be felt, and it's always going to hurt a little bit or hurt a lot. But it's just, how do you then shape it in a certain way where you again have agency and power over that trauma, or how does that involve the healing process through whatever these different mediums that we're working through?
Amelia, do you have any thoughts?
I'm going to call out Poe over here. Me and Poe were chatting last night about the artifacts from our cultures that end up in museums. You know, that maybe something my great-great-great-grandmother made will be in a museum, but only after she's gone and all of the generations are gone. And then the same artifact I might make may not be in the museum. So it's again about that fact that it has value once there is an erasure of the person who created it. But then we were talking about the artifacts and how you make them. Like if you're making a quilt or if you're beading together or you're working on something together, that it's the act of making it becomes a social space where we're telling each other stories, where we're creating our culture through the making of it. And the object is not what matters in that. It's never has been what mattered. It's the teaching from one generation to the next, the making it together and looking at each other's faces and spending 4 hours a day talking and creating this community together. And so, I mean, I guess I think that there is still a big importance on creating an object, and I would say even a film is an object in that way. And I love your work in the sense of saying, maybe not telling the story, but leaving a space for reminding people to tell stories to each other offline. It can even be like something that isn't represented, but you are representing a space for that object, reminding us to move and to talk together. And we were also talking about how it can be new forms. It doesn't have to be us just beating together, knowing that, okay, maybe we won't have time for 3 weeks to make this one thing together, but we can make a blog post, we can do a podcast together. These things are the same cultural tradition that we've had, that our great-great-great-grandmother may have some piece in the Met of a cornhusk doll, but we have a podcast, and that's the same thing, because it's about sitting together and spending time and making something and sharing our stories. So, thank you, Poe.
Yeah, I love that so much because thinking about, Black history and the fact of not having the idea of yourself, of Black culture, just fundamentally being born out of struggle, racism, and slavery. It's the idea of a Black person, at least in the Western U.S. standard, and how, there were no artifacts, there was no anything really that sort of from those times that represented a culture from an internal perspective. It was all sort of, like when we think about, artifacts from that time, you're like literal shackles or like a literal noose. Like it's just traumatic stuff. And to me, the connection between, the past and now, specifically in Black culture, is like this sort of oral history, like the things are remembered and they're shared. And with that, with the passing on of stories comes, humans' imagination to alter their stories and for them to become fantastic and for them to become incredible and for them to be illogical and for them to be unrealistic. And I think one problem with media currently is this forced narrative of logic, There's nothing logical about being a human. Like, reality is not logical, Now we have created structures to understand it, but as folks know, the more we get to know, the more we're like, shit, like we really don't know what any of this stuff's made of, But we can understand it and we can manipulate it and we have our rules and we have our ways. And so I think with the idea of experience creation in cinema, like the idea of having stories that don't abide by X, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or a rearrangement of letters to equal anything that's comprehensible, but more something that's ambiguous and can offer an insight into perhaps a perspective that one doesn't have, not a trajectory which one can be like, whoa, that was an interesting story, Although I think stories are important, I think narratives are important. I also think abstraction and confusion is just as valuable. Also, one more thing, I really get one thing. I've always had a chip on my shoulder with this. When you like, and this is specifically for like doc films, because I feel like there's this huge. People are like, oh, what an emotional story. Oh, the emotion of that. Like if you can, if a dog like walks across the street and almost gets hit by a car, that's emotional. Like emotion is easy. Like we're humans. Commercials, people can cry during commercials. Like that's what we do. Like, and the problem is that we think that because something is touching or moving, that it's visual justice, or that it's responsible, or that it's interesting, or that it's contributing to anything, and that's not the case. I think that's one problem with doc films, is that there's this idea of being moved supersedes everything else that's critical and everything else that is important. And I feel like having an emotional experience is quite important in life. But I think that there needs to be other values embedded in doc and in films, like responsibility, you know?
One point, going back to what you were saying about colonization, right? And I think about media, and I think about what happened with Nathan Phillips this last week. It was just really extraordinary. And I think, and we learned from our research, that Americans really love the romantic, beautiful stereotype of Native peoples, right? And we're singing, and we're about the jewelry we wear, and we talk to the stars, according to one woman in Phoenix, Arizona. And I was like, I missed out on that superpower. That's awesome. But I think in that moment, what it was so interesting that everybody gravitated toward Nathan when he was singing, and it was like everyone sort of rushed to his defense. But it really makes me think about colonization, because then all of a sudden it did not take much for like, oh no, this poor young white boy, no, there's no way he could have done anything wrong. And it's just suddenly how quickly that narrative shifted so fast. No matter, I was talking to a good friend Heather Ray, you know, about if you watch the whole video and sort of watch how this thing unfolded, and to really understand what he was just trying to do was just trying to intervene and sort of diffuse between sort of both sides involved. But what was so interesting is it just really reminded me about the erasure of Native peoples, right? And that, I mean, they're clearly people doing the tomahawk chop and, you know, doing this and just all kinds of stuff, but Americans aren't even aware that that's racist. Right, at all. There was nothing wrong with it. They were just, hey, they were like, you know, playing along, and it was all cool. And so it just, again, kind of going back to your point around colonization, it's like the way that whole thing played out is just really symptomatic of, I think, everything about how Native people have been treated in this country and how those dominant narratives work, right? Or what, you know, talking about, well, this boy, he's just a great, I'm not bagging on Catholics, but, you know, like, oh, he's a great Catholic boy and all, but we could talk about the history of what the Catholic Church has done to Native people. But yet, nope, we're going to sweep that under the rug too. So I just think that that's part of the narrative around Native people and around the erasure that has to be confronted, and we have to reconcile that to move forward.
Did you say there were certain findings around, in your data, the perceptions of the sports mascot idea? That there was actually a belief that it was honoring people?
Yeah, I mean, that is so entrenched in the American psyche. I mean, we saw a lot of positive movement on, you know, the things that we found is that if you start to re-educate Americans, so if you just introduce some basic historical facts, and you kind of center it around maybe some values that we can each share if you're having a conversation, that you can remind people that we're still here, that will kind of get them to move, but not on that mascot issue. It's just like, no, we're honoring them. Like, that's fine. What? I mean, it's so PC. Why are they crying around? I mean, it's just like story after story, and then we would introduce some kind of facts about the high rates of suicide amongst Native American youth, the highest in the country, and it's so tied to poor self-esteem, and studies done by Dr. Stephanie Freiberg showing the impact that racist sports mascots have on Native American children and their mental health and well-being. And it would kind of move people for a minute, but then it was like, no. Because it's just, I think it's that dehumanizing force. The only movement that we did see was millennial young women were the only ones out of all the demographics that we studied that were supportive of ending that. So it just really goes to show that, you know, it's really interesting to me in this country that suddenly everybody really gets it, that blackface is not okay, right? I think we've started to really train people on that. But somehow, like there's a more recent study that Dr. Freiberg has done around redface, and you can put them side by side and everyone's like, blackface is bad, redface, that's fine. So we have a lot of work to do. It's incredible.
A lot of unlearning. Yeah.
There should be a team in the U.S. It should be like the Alabama Slave Masters. And it's like, no, for real. But hear me out.
Seriously.
Hear me out. I just don't want. It's the history of the. We don't want to lose the history. We just want to make sure that everyone knows. And the guy like walks out with a whip, and he's like, yeah. You know. And I'm not comparing the native emblem to that, but like.
Right, but it might be flipping the script, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Like when I talk about representation, for audiences, I'm like, look. Like, what if every single image, what if 99.9% of the images made about Americans or of Americans were made by the British? Or were made by, like, the Chinese? Or were made by those in India? Like, what would America look like? Like, that's what our cultures look like. to us at least, but not to those who are making it, because in some way they think they're responsible or they're thinking a little bit about it, but like, there's nothing better than self-representation.
Wow. Well, I do believe we want to open up for questions at some point. So let's go ahead and do that. Does anybody have any questions? There's one back here.
A lot about, is that working? There we are. We're talking a lot about content narrative. I'm just curious, aesthetically and formally, how you feel that those sort of narratives or stuff develop in your own work, and how you think of them aesthetically and formally in different ways.
I mean, I'm ready. Well, I mean, I think about participation in the world in which is in front of the camera, as opposed to capturing the world. Like, I made a film, Hale County This Morning, this evening, and the idea was to, if I don't have a big budget to, like, to do imaginative stuff, like, how do I join the lives of those who I'm encountering? And that produces, specifically, when I tell students that are like doc filmmakers, I'm like, though I think there's nothing more important than people making films about other people. Obviously, that's important, because you need to be able to see yourself in some sense. But make a film about a place you would be anyway, because that's sort of like a natural life, your natural flow. But when you film with and you participate in the life of someone, you're not interested in capturing them. You're interested in being with them, and that like, also the gaze is not this. The gaze is like beside them, and then they shift in front of the frame. So that changes everything. Also, when you're doing something you're really familiar with, you have a version of it in your head that needs to be represented through the medium in a way that is really not what other folks would do, right? So if you've seen Hale County, people are like, oh, it's so intimate, like, and I'm like, well, it is because of quote unquote access, but just as much, I feel like, and I'm generally speaking, of like if my white friend had come and filmed Daniel and Quincy, he would be satisfied with being right here. Like this, he's like, oh shit, like I'm in the house, I'm like with the kids. But because I'm looking at Quincy in the way in which I look at my brother and my dad, and I'm conscious of the way in which images are made and the way in which the way in which the interface is representing, I'm trying to capture something that's more related to my reality, to the way I grew up and the way in which I see people. And that changes aesthetics, and then aesthetics become personal, and they become idiosyncratic, and then they become, like Sky's film that he has in the shorts program, they become a Peachapong's things, you start using the technology as part of your own visual language by default. Yeah. So I think it should always be a negotiation of the person and the thing,
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested, I guess, in like the mundane. Like, I've always been really interested in how can my work illustrate something that's very simple and uncomplicated in the most beautiful way possible, in the way that and so a lot of the time for me, it's a matter of spending a lot of time with the people that I'm working with in a similar way, and then really just positioning the work that is not too far from just my own eye, and then working with lighting, things that it's a sort of like an odd balance of like tons of control and then no control at all. And to be more specific, so the film that we have here with America, like I was working with the Buffalo Soldiers, for instance, which is a historically black horse riding club, or these blacksmiths, which are a third generation blacksmith company that, which is part of a trade that used to be really dominant in New Orleans, a black orchestra. I didn't have them do anything that they weren't already doing, but it was more about how can I frame this in a way that almost looks like a photograph. Like, my goal really was that I'd like you to be able to pause the film at any moment, and it could be an icon. It could be put on a poster. It could be put on a billboard. And it could represent something much larger than the narrative of whatever that film was a part of.
I think of virtual reality as dream technology, and it's because when you're in virtual reality, you're moving without moving, you're touching without touching, you're walking without walking, you're flying without flying, and you can do things that you can only do in your dreams. and it's based primarily in animation. And I think dreams and animation can be an incredible form of fantasy, where I can imagine spaces that are unburdened. And so I truly love that type of aesthetic, that freedom of being able to imagine spaces that the human body may not have, my human body may not be able to experience, but something that my ancestors may have, and something that the celestial bodies that created us are there as well. So, yeah.
One more back here.
Hi, I had a
Oh, sorry, Sky wanted to say something. Sorry.
Oh, well,
Before
it's
this
not
next
that
question.
important. I mean, it's just- well, I guess like just briefly, I mean, with the relationship to the clip that you saw, Dislocation Blues, I was really thinking about the conventional documentary form with the talking head, and how I was reacting to or against that in certain ways, where there are, like I mentioned before, like there are no stories being told. It's always a reaction to the stories, and there is no images of actions or violence. It's people either responding in such a way that is not about the sensationalized aspect of what people expect from those things. And so playing with the form in that sense is a way for me to try and expand or be a bit insidious with viewers and what they're expecting, and where at the end they may not understand exactly what these stories were, but the impressions of them and how those may relate to a different experience of that. And I mean, like, well, it was streaming on Mubi for 30 days. And one of the unfortunate things about that was they have comments. And I remember like there's like 2 or 3 comments that people wrote. They're like, this is not making me feel anything. You need to make something that is, you know, like that, and then I can get on board with this. But right now I don't feel anything, and you need to, like, you know, focus on the sensationalized aspects of that. And so, I mean, in a sense, like, that's a success, you know, because I'm not giving into the formal desires of this form, of this medium, into those expectations of an audience that want to see violence, that want to see natives getting beat up, they want to see people suffering, and rather, what are the other things that you can show them that expands that form or expands those different choices that go into these different modes of representation? Or misrepresentation.
Yep.
Thank you, Sky. Okay, we'll go back over here.
Hi, my question is about protecting your art or voices from co-opting. Because I know in a lot of ways, I'm from New Orleans originally, and a lot of ways our culture becomes tourist culture when people come to town. And from our perspective, we're like, we want to shine light on our issues and our things, but to the tourists, it's just, you know, music and drinks and fun and things like that. And I know that, you know, with native cultures, it can be bastardized as far down as, you know, a logo, and someone thinks that they're honoring your culture. So I want to know, how do you as auteurs and filmmakers protect your cultures and voices, but also allow them room to breathe and become something new for the next generation?
It's a really good question. I think, you know, I'm curious to see, because we're all coming from different places, but, you know, New Orleans, yeah, that's a really big issue in New Orleans, particularly with second lines. And, you know, recently now we have a lot of companies that are coming and doing sort of like branded content and hiring people who, you know, are local, who are from there. And on one hand, it's a great opportunity. It's a way to make money that, you know, a lot of local places are not offering. And then at the same time, you have this question of exploitation. And I'm maybe this is sort of a controversial way of thinking about it, but I know in my own heart that I find that when I start to, you know, first and foremost, I think the way in which you work with people is a way to absolutely try to address exploitation from the get-go. I think that you need to be uplifting the people that are around you. You need to have a sense of what the local economy is. So if you're getting paid $7.25 an hour, which is what the hourly rate is in New Orleans, you need to be aware of that and understand, okay, well, what does it mean then to bring people on and ask them, I'm not gonna ask them to work for free, how am I gonna, you know, pay them for that work, right? And how am I gonna include them in the process of, one, where the outcome is of the material, what the creative, you know, ask questions. I mean, I think that's, for me, when I'm shooting, I'm not asking anyone to do something that they wouldn't normally do, and I'm very clear about why I'm making it. And if that resonates, great, and if it doesn't, we don't work together. You know, and I think the other part of it is that there's something in your heart, for me at least, that starts to lock up when I think about, and I think I also work with a lot of young people, and it's a sort of unfortunate situation when people start saying, well, I'm not going to do this because I don't want to be criticized for or being accused of being exploitative. And that, I think that question ranges from a lot of people. You can still be Black and you can still be Native and you can still exploit your own people. And that's a nuanced question that I think we need to start thinking about as well. It's not always just an outsider coming in. And so, I don't know, I'm sort of babbling right now, but I really think that it's in your heart. Like, I think that the way that you prevent you from creating exploitive work is going to be in your heart and the way that you work with people. And I'm not really sure that there's a way I'm not sure how effective it is to spend a lot of time as artists for us to prevent those companies from coming in and doing that. I think it's all about us building community and working with each other and continuing, as we've sort of talked about here, about creating a counter, right? Instead of putting our energy toward what isn't working, what can we do in our own sort of fort and space to make beautiful stuff that is actually serving everybody who's involved in it, and not those who aren't as well, obviously.
I think if I can offer perspective, a lot of the filmmakers that I work with, which I meet across the country, around the world, indigenous filmmakers, there's kind of this unspoken rule that I come across that art filmmakers have, is that there are certain places where the camera should not go. And those are sacred spaces, ceremonies, religious ceremonies. And it's just kind of like this rule that I feel like a lot of people from our community have. I don't know if you guys come across that as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I just shot a 360 video piece with my best friend, Wendy Red Star, on her reservation. And we made all these packs of like, okay, but what if something like this happens? Okay, then we will erase that part. Okay, well, what if we go here and then this happens? Okay, we'll erase this. So we made all of these decisions before we even started shooting of what we would retract or erase that hadn't even been captured yet. And we were, it was a new camera. There isn't anywhere you can hide. There isn't a way you can angle it away from something. It captures everything around you, above and below you. So even the act of carrying it to certain places, we were like, okay, it will capture things that what if certain types of the horses that roam free, we wanted to protect them. We didn't want people to know that they're in certain parts because people go and capture them. So we were like, how can we prevent a horse from coming into this frame? It's capturing everything. But it was really fun for us to both just be right on the same page, like how amazing it was to not have to explain to each other that like, we were gonna go to this certain space that everyone was saying something might happen, and we were like, if it happens, like we will turn the camera off, right? Or if it doesn't, we will. And it was just really beautiful to have a collaborator that I didn't have to explain that to, and that's because, we're Native sisters. So it's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
Well, we do have to wrap. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
I mean, I have no problem not.
But say it.
Okay. Yeah, no. I love the ethics of shooting. There's like, we have a camera person, ethics of shooting here, by the way. KJ, shout out. Anyway, she's my friend. There's nothing gets to me more than hearing a videographer or a director or a cinematographer being like, just get the shot. Like, you got to get the shot. There are things that are more important than cinema. There are things that are more important than the documentary. Like, these are things that help. They're not it, though they are supposed to do the best they can to do all these different things. I think, I love that there's sacred spaces that people can't film, because I don't think people understand that there's many ways to get to the complexity of the human condition, to trauma, drama, joy, elation, everything, without showing it. Yeah. You don't have to visualize. The suffering doesn't need to be visualized in certain ways. The culture doesn't have to be visualized in X, Y, and Z, and whatever. I just get angry. I just start getting mad.
Well, thank you for that concluding comment on our behalf. And I just want you guys to give a hand to our wonderful panel. And to our audience watching on our live stream. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the festival.